Franciscans had an answer to the Dominican scholastic that we looked at in the previous episode. In fact, Thomas Aquinas' Franciscan counterpart, he lived at the same time. His name was John Bonaventure. Born in Tuscany in 1221 as John Fidanza, he became known as Bonaventure when he had a miraculous recovery from a grave illness as a child of only 4. Upon regaining his health, his mother announced, Bonaventura, good fortune, and the name stuck. While Aquinas was predominantly a theologian, Bonaventure was both a theologian and an accomplished administrator in the affairs of the Franciscans. Where Thomas was precise but dry, John was a mystic who was given to eloquence. If Aquinas was prosaic, Bonaventure was poetic. Bonaventure joined the Franciscans and immediately excelled in his studies. He spent 3 years in Paris studying under the scholastic scholar Alexander of Hales. Alexander paid his pupil a huge compliment when he said that in Bonaventure, quote, Adam seems to have not sinned, unquote. Now, finishing his studies in Paris, he stayed to teach, filling the spot of John of Parma when he took on the leadership of the Franciscans. He was only 26. Now, anyone else would have been in over their heads at that age, since Bonaventure became the leader of the Franciscans when they were being split by the fracture that we talked about in an earlier episode. He took a middle position between the two parties and was able to negotiate an uneasy peace. It was a brutally hard assignment, but Bonaventure pulled it off with aplomb and earned the title of the second founder of the order. The entire idea of mendicancy came under assault during his term at the helm of the Franciscans. He penned a tract that silenced the opposition and reinforced support for the mendicants. At the direction of the First Franciscan General Council at Narbonne in 1260, he wrote The Legend of Francis, which is the authoritative Franciscan account of the order's founder. In 1273, he was made Cardinal of Albano, Italy, and died in Lyon while attending a church council the next year. The Pope performed extreme unction for him, and his funeral was attended by dignitaries from all over the Christian world. He was declared a Doctor of the Church in 1587, one of the highest honors the Roman Church can bestow. Dante, who was a fierce critic of sham religion, he gave Bonaventure great honor by placing him beside Thomas Aquinas. These two will always be considered by students of church history kind of side by side. One historian of medieval theology calls them the illuminating stars on the horizon of the 13th century. Aquinas had the sharper mind, but Bonaventure the warmer heart. Maybe this is why each joined their respective orders, Thomas the Dominicans and John the Franciscans. Bonaventure enjoyed great popularity as a preacher. Being a poet, his sermons were far more eloquent than his peers. When Bonaventure wrote, like Aquinas, he turned his mind to theology and provided much to cleaning up the thoughts of the day. To give an idea of what kinds of things the scholastics wrestled with, here are some of the topics that Bonaventure weighed in on: the Trinity, creation, sin, the Incarnation, grace, the Holy Spirit, sacraments, and the afterlife. Now, having dealt with these basic topics, he engaged a whole host of other subjects that were more popular to discuss. Things like, could God have made a better world? Could he have made it sooner than he did? Can an angel be in several places at the same time? Can several angels be at the same time and in the same place? At the moment of his creation, was Lucifer corrupt? Did he belong to the order of angels? Is there a hierarchy among fallen angels? Do demons have foreknowledge of contingent events? Bonaventure discussed whether or not sexual intercourse took place before the fall, whether or not before the fall men and women were equal. Did Adam or Eve sin more grievously by eating the forbidden fruit? With such weighty and important stuff, no wonder these guys spent a good part of their time sitting at a desk studying. Bonaventure agreed with Aquinas in denying that Mary was immaculately conceived and free of original sin. He disagreed with his fellow Franciscan, Scotus, on the issue of transubstantiation, though Scotus differed from Aquinas on precisely what the bread and the wine became. He did accept the idea that they become more than mere bread and wine, while Bonaventure held to a symbolic nature for the communion elements. While Bonaventure was a brilliant mind, it's not his theology he's known for. It's hard to be when you live at the same time as Thomas Aquinas. He's best known as a mystic and the author of the Life of St. Francis. While Aquinas' Summa became the theological textbook for the Roman Church, it was Bonaventure's devotional writings that stirred the hearts of thousands of everyday priests to see God by grace and through his word. And that brings us to another Franciscan and the last of the scholastics that we're going to consider, John Dunne Scotus. Now, let me begin by saying that the Scotists, that is the followers of Duns Scotus, and the Thomists, the followers of Aquinas, formed the two great theological schools of the Middle Ages. The battle between them was fierce. At times it turned violent. I have to say that in reviewing Scotus's work, I have a difficult time grasping his thought. Being of only average intelligence myself, most of his work goes right over my head. Scotus was a serious brainiac, and when I read him, I'm lost. Now, I'm going to attempt a summary of his work later, but first, let's take a look at his life. We can cover it quickly because there's really not much to tell about him. We don't know that much about him. He was born John Dunne in Scotland, and thus the Latin nickname Scotus, by which he's best known. Scotus became a priest and joined the Franciscans. Most of his career was spent lecturing at Oxford. He eventually taught at Paris and Cologne, where he died in 1308. A monument to Scotus in the Franciscan church at Cologne bears this inscription: Scotia gave me birth, England nursed me, Gaul educated me, Cologne holds my ashes. Among the stories told of Duns Scotus is one that gives more insight into his thoughts than entire chapters of his complex written discourses. Scotus engaged an English farmer on the subject of religion. The conversation came round to predestination. The farmer, who was sowing his field, said to Scotus, "Why do you speak to me? If God has foreknowledge that I will be saved whether I do good or ill." Now Scotus replied, "Well, if God has foreknowledge that your grain in your bag will grow out of the soil, it will grow whether you sow it or withhold your hand. You may as well save yourself the labor that you're at." Scotus's point was clear. Without the farmer sowing the seed, it wouldn't gain the soil. If it didn't gain the soil, it wouldn't sprout, which meant that God would have known that the farmer never sowed. If it did sprout, it was because God knew the farmer would sow it. Even so, the farmer could not be saved without the change the gospel brings, and the gospel would not be heard unless Scotus shared it. So if God knew the farmer was going to be saved, it was because he knew Scotus was going to speak up, affecting a change in the farmer. Scotus's mind was more critical than constructive. He tended to pick apart the thoughts and conclusions of others than to develop or declare his own positions. His work feels reactionary, though he was just using the dialectical method that was in fashion among the scholastics of that time. And you'll remember that the great endeavor of the scholastics was to link faith and reason, to show that faith wasn't irrational, it was super-rational. They aimed to show that the intellect was a tool to inform and strengthen faith, not weaken it. Something completely lost to later theologians of the liberal bent. Scotus is regarded as the last of the scholastics because his work undercut their previous endeavors. By using the questioning methodology of the dialectic, he attacked not the sufficiency of faith as some scholastics had. No, he attacked the sufficiency of reason as the means to arrive at knowledge. He subjected scholastic propositions to intense scrutiny. He showed how several of the theological propositions of the church were difficult to support by reason, and yet the church said that they were true. So, the problem had to be with reason, not with church dogma. Some things had to be accepted, he said, by faith. Scotus's adeptness at asking questions that back people into logical corners earned him both supporters and enemies. At times, his thoughts were so elaborate, his writing so confusing, that today we refer to a muddle-headed person as a dunce, a word derived from his name. Now, Scotus spent much of his time on the subject of the will. It's his work on that framed the philosophical base for the reformers and their views on God's sovereignty and election. Scotus was the first major Catholic theologian to support the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary. That says that the mother of Jesus, though herself born of human parents, was conceived in holiness without the taint of original sin. That idea had been set forward a century earlier in France, where it immediately met with controversy. Well, Scotus defended the view at a public debate in Paris, employing 200 lines of argument for its support and winning the university to his side. Although Aquinas rejected it, Scotus's view won the day. In December of 1854, Pope Pius IX, a Franciscan, declared the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception to be a divinely revealed fact and official Catholic dogma. Aquinas' reputation in philosophy and theology has eclipsed Scotus's, though Scotus influenced a wide range of later thinkers, including the 18th century German Protestant philosopher Leibniz and the 20th century French Catholic theologian Teilhard de Chardin. The existentialism of the 20th century resurrected Scotus's emphasis on will over reason. If you take a college philosophy class today, most likely you'll be told that faith and reason are utterly separate. Reason, it's postulated, is based on evidence and the faculty of the mind. Faith is divorced from both reason and evidence, and reason, well, it always trumps faith. Now, this is a complete reversal from the Scholastics, who may be attributed with some of the loftiest moments in the long history of philosophical analysis. For them, faith came first, with reason a tool that helped fill out and bolster faith. Duns Scotus began the drift away from that by showing how untrustworthy reason could be. His goal was to remind scholastics that in their emphasis on reason, they'd neglected the primacy of faith. But in the divorce that he postulated between faith and reason, what happened was that later thinkers ran with reason as separate and superior to faith. If Duns Scotus showed up at a college philosophy lecture today, he'd weep that his ideas had been so poorly developed, and then he would annihilate the shoddy thinking of that purely secular professor.